Hello, welcome to Talk Wildlife. And today the subject is going to be something that, whilst they're very rarely acknowledged, are one of the most kept pets in the world. They're the most popular pet in the world. They fund, as part of a sport, a multi-billion pound operation globally. But they are quite overlooked. And they also, we're talking here about, they form about a quarter of the vertebrates on the planet. And I'm talking about fish, but I'm not just talking about any fish. I'm talking about fish that don't live in the sea. I'm talking about fish that live in fresh water. And I've got with me Michael Edmondstone from SHOAL, and he's the communications and engagement lead. And we're going to talk, number one, about fish, but ones that are in fresh water, and also the reports that talks about the forgotten fish. So what I'd like to do is welcome Michael, who is the spokesperson for freshwater fish globally. Hiya, Michael, how are you?
Hello, Alan. Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. And yeah, thanks for having me on. It's a great opportunity to talk about freshwater conservation. And I certainly can't take the credit for being the spokesperson for freshwater fish globally, but thank you very much. I'll take it for now.
Yeah, I think you should definitely. Well, somebody's got to do it. So SHOAL is a conservation organisation for freshwater fish. Give us a little bit of background to SHOAL and who you are and what you do.
Okay, so we are a relatively new organisation. We were established in the spring 2019. And for much of the time since then, it has really just been my boss, the executive director, Mike Bolster. He's been really shouldering the organisation himself as it kind of picks up steam and grows. And it really came off the back of recognizing that there's a huge need for freshwater conservation, but it's not being filled by any particular really focused organization. Nobody's really focusing on freshwater fish in particular, but all freshwater species. And there's a huge need for it. There's it's a real issue that okay, so one of the kind of key facts is that 84% of freshwater species have populations have fallen by 84% in the last 50 years. And 95% of kind of megafish, that's fish larger than 30 kilograms, their populations have plummeted by 94% in 50 years. So the numbers are really staggering. 1 in 3 freshwater vertebrates are threatened with extinction, but still they're kind of overlooked and underfunded, not given the attention that they so desperately need. So SHOAL really came out of that, and we've been growing ever since. We're very outward looking, very determined to be a partnership. Partnerships at the core of what we do. So we're not doing the conservation on the ground. We forge the right partnerships with the right organizations who are able to deliver the most impactful work. We partner with leading scientists around the world to use the best research to guide our strategy. So yeah, in a nutshell, we came out of a desperate need for urgent and highly focused conservation work on freshwater species.
Right, okay, and you quoted some figures there. So what I think we'll do is we'll put freshwater fish into context by just talking about some of the figures, because I think, they will surprise some people. But what we'll do is we'll start off by saying, okay, so, we're talking about freshwater fishes here. So freshwater fishes, presumably we're talking about rivers, lakes, ponds, other freshwater habitats. And I think if I remember rightly from your report, we're talking about just 1% of the planet is covered in fresh water. So
yeah, that's right.
1% of the land. We won't go into how big the sea is, but 1% of the land. So
No, it's 1% of the entire world's surface, not just land. 1% of the
Yeah,
planet's surface
1% of the planet's world surface.
yeah.
So, so we're talking 1%, but tell us what percentage of fishes on the planet are freshwater fishes?
Well, it might surprise a lot of your listeners to know that actually a majority of fish globally come from rivers, lakes, and wetlands. It's around 51%, so only slightly more. But yeah, like you say, if you consider that only 1% of the planet is fresh waters, it's really staggering. And around 12% of all species on the planet live in fresh waters, in less than 1% of the surface. So the biodiversity is intense. It's comparable to rainforests or coral reefs. It's really biodiverse. Yeah, but still doesn't get the attention yet.
Yeah, and I mentioned the home a quarter of vertebrates. So in saying that, are we talking about that quarter of vertebrates, it's made up from fish, or is that fish and the other mixture of sort of amphibs and amphibians and reptiles and other stuff?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So it's not just fish; it would be all freshwater species. So yeah, crocodiles, for instance, would be part of that, and yeah, other vertebrate species too.
So clearly, by
Still
doing what you're doing and highlighting the plight of freshwater fish, you're basically highlighting the plight of a habitat that is significantly important in the fact that it does house a quarter of the vertebrates. So whatever you're doing for freshwater fish is going to have a knock-on effect on the likes of, as you mentioned, crocodiles. It's going to be beneficial to them as well.
Yeah, 100%. They call it the kind of the canary in the coal mine. So healthy freshwater fish populations are indicative of a healthy freshwater, and healthy freshwaters are really essential, obviously, for the species around it, in the ponds, rivers, wetlands, lakes, but also for the surrounding terrestrial environments as well. Conserving freshwater environments has been shown to have positive knock-on effects for the lands, whereas the reverse isn't true. If you just focus your attentions on terrestrial, freshwaters don't get swept along for the ride. And that's not even taking into consideration the importance that freshwaters have for people, for food security and livelihoods. They really rely on it. Hundreds of millions of people worldwide need healthy freshwaters. So it's really, really key, not just for the intrinsic values of the animals, but also for people.
Yeah, and you're right. Number one is a food source. What struck me from the report is just how popular they are as pets. Now, when I read that, it was sort of a double-edged sword, because it's a case of, right, okay, so clearly freshwater fish really popular with the pet trade. Is that an issue, the fact that they're so popular in the pet trade?
No, it's really an opportunity. The conversation about wild caught, there are so many regulations around the world to ensure that endangered species aren't fished out, and hopefully you'd like to think that they're generally being adhered to. Certainly in the kind of more developed countries, they're likely to be adhered to, certainly in the kind of household name pet shops, that kind of thing. Some may slip through the net, if you excuse the pun, but it's not really considered that the wild caught isn't really a huge part of the problem. But there is a huge opportunity there, because obviously all these people, as you say, it's the world's most popular pet, fishes. So there's a really key focused audience already who's investing lots of money into it, multi-billion-dollar industry, really engaged people, but a lot of them don't necessarily understand about the freshwater issues, and they don't know where they'd start to help with it. So that's a big part of what we're doing, is trying to engage the aquarium and work with them collaboratively to try and find the solutions to some of these issues.
Yeah, and obviously the reason I asked the question as to whether it was a problem is because with something like caged birds, there are elements of well, illegality, if you like, where birds are taken from the wild and then resold as cage birds. And that has a detrimental effect on the species, something like, barley starling and things like that. Is there a similar issue or potential similar issue with fish? Because I never seem to sort of see or read anything about the fact that fish are, for one, I'm going to say this, but I'm going to hate myself for saying it, poached. Yeah. So fish are poached. You don't really hear about fish being poached, for the sort of pet trade. So is it the case that actually they're not, or is it under the radar, or is it, that it does happen and I'm just not seeing about it?
I think sadly it does happen, and I'm not sure how taboo that's considered in the industry. As I understand it, it's considered pretty regular for hobbyists to go to an area that has a particular species and just kind of scoop it out the water and take it home. It's surely one of the only kind of groups of animals where that happens, where it's so kind of accepted, and it's not murky. People talk quite openly about it in hobbyist websites and forums and magazines about kind of going to Malaysia or Indonesia or somewhere on a bit of a fish finding mission and scooping some fish out and taking them home. Obviously, from our perspective, that's really problematic, and we need to kind of open lines of communication with them to talk about the pros, the cost versus the benefit of doing that. There's a strong argument that if the species are highly robust, if the populations are really strong, then it's not doing too much harm. It's more the kind of habitat fragmentation and pollution, that kind of thing, that's really causing the population decline. And that's a pretty valid argument. But obviously, as soon as the species start to become threatened, then it's much harder to justify.
Right. Okay, well, look, let's, because we have sort of the bits and pieces that I've been pulling on there, have come from the report anyway. Let's talk about World's Forgotten Fishes, which is the report that's behind me. How did the report come about?
It was an alliance of conservation organizations, SHOAL being one. It was led by WWF. They got in touch with a number of organizations to help create this report. And then the kind of alliance grew and the report grew, and more information was fed into it. But really, it's almost a manifesto for SHOAL itself. It came about because of the urgency of the situation. It's a bit of a kind of now or never moment. Going into this new decade, the 2020s, it's a real opportunity to reverse the reds and bring lots of species back from the brink. So it was really an answer to the urgency of what's going on in freshwaters.
Right. Okay. And as I say, we have been sort of quoting some of the figures, and one figure that we've not touched on yet, which I'm about to, is number one, there are just over 18,000 freshwater fish on the planet, and of them, a third are threatened with extinction. So that's a significant percentage. That's 30%. That's a significant percentage. So what's driving that? What's, because obviously you hear about, orangutans are in trouble because of forest, deforestation, and you hear these things. What are the main causes of the decline in freshwater fishes?
Sure. As you can probably imagine, it's a number of different reasons. Similar to the orangutans that you just mentioned, habitat loss is a huge one. Draining rivers, diverting rivers, building over rivers, draining them for agriculture, that kind of thing. So taking away the initial habitat is one of the main reasons. Damming and river flooding is a huge issue as well. It's quite an emotive issue because lots of people rely on hydropower, but that's a whole other discussion about the kind of validity of green hydropower. There are arguably much better solutions for it. But what dam is up a river. So all the migratory fish that rely on, this artery to survive, to swim out to the sea and then back up river to their spawning grounds, they're faced with these huge concrete walls, and they can no longer get back to their spawning grounds or get to the sea. So they're cut off from their from the migratory routes. And that's taken a huge hit to populations. That's why was it 76% of migratory species have plummeted since 1970. So yeah, damming is a huge thing. Water abstraction, removing water, as I say, for irrigation. Pollution, chemical runoff, agrochemicals, or anything else. Rivers have maybe traditionally been used as a bit of, a bit of a sewer. Frankly, they're not respected. They're used as a kind of tool to get rid of human waste. So there's loads of pollution in rivers, which obviously harms the fish living in there. Overfishing, that's another big reason. As technology has improved and people find it easier to scoop out large numbers of fish, obviously that's going to take a huge hit to the populations. And then another huge reason is invasive species. People might not think anything of releasing their guppies in a river or releasing a turtle or something. They think they're giving it a second chance, but they spread diseases, and they can be predatory to the smaller fishes, or they can outcompete them for resources. So the Nile perch has been responsible for catastrophic fish declines. So invasive species is another one, and also it might sound surprising, but wildlife crime as well. People think of elephant and rhino poachers, but people are also poaching the European eel. There's this. It used to be so common that it was used as current ages, but that's critically endangered, and in no small part because of highly organized syndicate criminal gangs who have poached it and sold it to predominantly Asian market. So yeah, wildlife crime is a big one as well. And of course, the old nugget, climate change. That's kind of ruining everything for everyone. So yeah, that's a big one as well. Melting glacier water, changing temperatures, changing habitats. Yeah, climate change is also a big one. So yeah, numerous reasons.
Right. Okay. So 30% threatened with extinction. 80 fish have been, and it says in the report, 80 sort of fish have been classed as extinct in the wild. So that's right. 80 different species. Over what time scale are we talking there?
That is, let me get this right. I think that's it's since records started. I don't actually know the date, but it's since records started for this kind of thing. So a number of decades.
Absolutely. So we're talking sort of decades rather than a century or centuries.
Yeah. If you want, I can just check that. I think I can check that for you now, actually. But yeah, it's decades. It's since records began.
Right. Okay. No worries. That so 80 extinct fish, third threatened with extinction. Why should people watching this care? Why should they care about freshwater fish?
Okay. Yeah. Well, aside from the intrinsic value of the creatures themselves, it's kind of a moral discussion about whether we as humans have the right to cause catastrophic extinctions. There's a really compelling argument that we don't know how biodiversity benefits us. We're finding out all the time how nature can help find solutions to human issues. There have been medicines for, I believe, cancer have been found from coral reefs, and the antiviral drugs have been found from coral reefs. There's tons of medicines found in forests as well. And until we really understand the how creatures may benefit humanity, it kind of makes sense for us to keep them around for longer. They might be able to find solutions to real problems that we haven't thought about. Also, there's the interconnectivity of things. So if you remove one species from an ecosystem, it's not, one species is gone and everything else kind of carries on as normal. Everything's intrinsically connected to everything else. So if you remove one species, there's a huge knock-on effect. And you're seeing that maybe some of your viewers would be familiar in oceans, for instance, where you get kind of algal blooms and blooms of jellyfish because one species has been removed. Or just thinking off the top of my head, I think there was somewhere where sea otters disappeared, and then there was this sudden bloom of sea anemones, which kind of just devastated the habitat. So yeah, it's not just keystone, cornerstone species. It's everything's linked to everything else. And if you start to allow species to die, then the logical conclusion in the long run is that we'll be left with very, very little.
Yeah, and of course you did sort of touch on it there, but they're an important sort of food source, both for the food chain to sustain a food chain, but also for a lot of humans. And for a lot of sort of indigenous people in various parts of the world, they are a major food source, if not one of the only food sources. So clearly that's another sort of valid reason. Now, it might sound counterproductive to say, well, they're a food source for humans, but a lot of humans on the planet have been living sort of side by side with fish and hunting fish for many, many, many decades, and without any detriment to the fish. And it's unfortunate that other activities have come along and other threats have come along that you've alluded to that have now sort of move that balance, and all of a sudden what has been sort of a partnership in harmony, if you like, for want of a better phrase, of indigenous people catching and living off the land, has now almost become lumped in with the threats and being given names like poaching and stuff like that. So I think from that point of view as well, extremely important. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. You're absolutely right. As we talked about earlier, hundreds of millions of people around the world depend on food security and their livelihoods on freshwater fish. So if humans are kind of helping one problem by building factories around an area that then pollute the rivers, then it's creating another problem by displaced peoples and hungry, starving people. So there needs to be some sense with planning and a bit of foresight to incorporate the ecological environment on kind of human planning, because the knock-on effects can be really harmful to people as well as the animals.
Yeah. Now, the report also includes sort of an action plan, for want of a better phrase, a recovery plan for how, and it's something like 6 points, but it's how, we can safeguard fish going forward. Before we come on to that, though, you mentioned the eel, which the eel is, it's to me a mega fish, to do what it does, starting off in, sort of the rivers, going out to sea, spending sort of time at sea and coming back. Same with the salmon. A lot of people won't realize that salmon actually sort of, they start life as freshwater fish, become a saltwater fish, and come back to freshwater. Tell us about sort of a couple of the sort of what you would class as, well, these are the pinup freshwater fishes that people either may or may not have heard of, that you think, these could be the equivalent to WWF's tigers and gorillas. These are the things you should be looking at.
Yeah, well, I agree with you that the salmon and the eel are both incredible. They have such incredible stories to them. And it totally can take a mantle for being kind of pinups for the freshwater conservation movement. There are certainly other fish as well. In southern India, in the Cauvery River, there is this beautiful fish called the humpback marcia, and it's prized by anglers out there. All around the world it's prized by anglers, and it's an incredibly beautiful fish. They call it the tiger of the water because it puts up such a fight when anglers are trying to reel it in. And it was actually anglers that realized it was the records of anglers that allowed scientists to realize that it's its own species, which shows how beneficial hobbyists, anglers, aquarists, aquarium hobbyists can be to science. So yeah, that's an incredibly charismatic species. The Mekong giant catfish is absolutely huge. It's more than 100 kilograms. It's a huge weight of a fish, and there's hardly any of them left anymore due to damming and pollution. So that's another real kind of poster child for the movement. Another fish that is quite kind of maybe more common knowledge is the various species of sturgeon. It's it's this ancient fish. It looks like a dinosaur. It's got all these kind of bony spines down its back. It looks ancient, and it's hundreds of millions of years old, and there are hardly any more of them left. But they used to, some of the sturgeon grow to many meters in length, and if you Google it, you'll see some photos. I think it's in Rome, sitting behind this absolutely ginormous fish. And yeah, maybe a lot of people don't realize that these fish can be so big and so charismatic and so interesting. But it's not just the large fish, I suppose. There's also really tiny fish, like the Parasphromenos, these tiny jewel-like, really popular in the aquarium hobby. And they live in the peat swamps of Indonesia and Malaysia. And the water there is this kind of tea-stained, blackish kind of, quite swampy kind of water, and covered in leaf litter, and it's really murky. But you hear stories of people going out to these environments and just lifting up a log, and suddenly there's 16, 17, 20, however many species of this gorgeous little jewel-like fish. So they're charismatic in a different way. They're kind of delicate. They're kind of delicate beauty, I suppose, and they're very rare as well. They're confined to these quite small habitats, which are being lost at a rate of knots for kind of to make way for agriculture. So yeah, there's lots of species that are kind of charismatic in a different way, and that's certainly a big part of what SHOAL is trying to do. I think we touched on that earlier. Is inspiring, kind of uncovering that world of wonder to show the incredible stories that fish can do. Certain catfish migrate more than 10,000 kilometers. To from the large to the small, to how another one. In Africa, there's this species of killifish. It's this tiny little fish, and it can spend its whole life living in an elephant's footprint. If there's some muddy, if there's kind of muddy terrain, it's been raining and there's a little puddle, then the eggs can lie dormant for quite a long period of time, and then when they get wet, the fish hatch, and it can spend its whole short life living in an elephant's footprint. It's just amazing how life kind of adapts to these very niche survival kind of mechanisms. Yeah,
that's incredible. So what's the lifespan of that fish?
not very long, sadly.
Especially if an elephant comes back along and follows its own footprints.
Yeah, or the rest of the herd's behind.
Yeah.
I couldn't tell you how many days or weeks it is. I'm not actually sure. But yeah, it's not a huge amount of time. But some fish can live for decades.
Yeah, and you've mentioned a few now, and there's a few more in the report, and I will put a link to the report, and I recommend people do go and have a read of it. But cichlids is another one that, the freshwater fish, and I'm sure I've said that right. I've always called them cichlids. They might be cyclids, but cichlids, is that right?
I call them cichlids. I've heard them called cichlids.
Yeah, I mean, people go on about Darwin and his finches and his mockingbirds and all the rest of it. If you want to see sort of evolution, you can't go wrong by looking at cichlids and how they've adapted to, you know, various parts of the lakes where they live. And I mean, that's another incredible story. So, you know, we could go on about fresh fish for a long time. You know, people should stop overlooking because they are, you know, endlessly fascinating. So we'll come to the protection of them. So like any good conservation organization, you know, you've not just talked about, look, you know, these are the issues. You've also come up with what you've called the recovery plan, which is basically, I mean, from looking at it, it's around about 6 points, and it's how this report recommends that governments go about sort of protecting these fish. So do you want to just walk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, but you're exactly right. It's called the 6-point emergency recovery plan for freshwater biodiversity. And it's not just kind of ideas that have been pulled from the air that people think will work. They've been shown to work in lots of case studies around the world. And the first point is to let rivers flow naturally. So removing dams, weirs and sluices, and restore them to their original flows. You know, many rivers have been siphoned into really kind of narrow routes, whereas before they used to be maybe be more circuitous. So maybe just allow nature to be restored to what it once was. Removing dams is an absolutely huge part of that. So it will really allow those migratory fish and other species as well to recover. Improve water quality in the freshwater ecosystem. So that means real policy change to penalize organizations that pollute rivers and lakes and wetlands, and incentivize them to clean up their act, frankly, to show them why it's so important, and that they need to have incentives to be able to be cleaner. So as soon as water quality is improved, populations have been shown to bounce back pretty quickly, much more so than in terrestrial. If you kind of give the environment a chance, it will bounce back. So yeah, that kind of leads on to the third point: protect and restore critical habitats. So give them that kind of legislation to protect them. Point 4 is end overfishing and unsustainable sand mining in rivers and lakes. So you know make what's taken out of those rivers and lakes sustainable. Point 5 is to prevent and control invasions by non-native species. And point 6 is protect free-flowing rivers and remove obsolete dams. So yeah, they all kind of lead into each other, but yeah, it's about allowing rivers to run naturally and giving them kind of real, meaningful legislation to protect them, to allow them to recover. Yeah,
and I mean 6 points. So, you know, like any solution to a conservation issue, you know, they're not rocket science and they're not difficult. You know, it's quite simple. It all revolves around something being adopted by governments and supported by people that might be watching this video, you know. So how do you plan on, first of all, engaging with people around those points, both sort of decision makers and general public? You know, how are you going to go about engaging with them, and then keeping it on the agenda, on the radar, so that people can sort of, when the next report comes out, it won't be called the world's forgotten fish. It'll be, you know, the fish that sort of came back from the brink. So how do you plan on engaging with people about that?
It's a case of keeping it in the news as much as as much as possible, is to keep shouting from the rooftops that it's urgent, and that it needs to be done now, and that if it is done, that real change will happen. So I mean, opportunities like the one you're giving us now is a great step to the way there. But being on podcasts and being in the press and publications, engaging as best we can with policymakers to really push the message out. As I said earlier, one of our kind of key strategic pillars is this idea of inspiring. So we're really keen to to give freshwater that kind of Jacques Cousteau moment, we call it, that Marine had a few decades ago, where people were taken beneath the surface to see this magical environment down there, and suddenly they started caring about it. And the same thing happened with Planet Earth, Blue Planet and Blue Planet 2. Almost overnight, David Attenborough changed people's perceptions of the ocean, and suddenly the plastics issue was household knowledge. And people were much more engaged in it, and freshwater really needs that moment. We can do what we can to push the message out, but we really need it would just be fantastic to have a series, a television show showing, not just theorizing it and talking about it, but showing the species, showing what they're doing, so people can sit back and turn on, Netflix or the BBC or whatever it is, and suddenly understand why they should care. So next time they buy a local canal, they'll think twice before kind of throwing a can in the canal. I really think that change starts kind of on a very small level and on a very large policy level, and you kind of need to get both at the same time. So yeah, to answer your question, it's really about bringing that world of wonder to people and inspiring people to care.
Yeah, and it is a world of wonder. I mean, delve into fish, and you will be surprised at what you find. There's a lot of sort of, not only a lot of different fish, but a lot of different behaviors that are fascinating. So clearly you've mentioned they also have a significant importance across the globe. So good luck with your work. Good luck with sort of promoting the report. Maybe in the future we'll talk again, and we'll sort of talk a lot more sort of positively, and we'll be talking about, right, well, now there's not a third of threatened, it's not 30%, it's down to 15%, and then we'll talk after that and it'll be down to 0%. Fingers crossed. But yeah, well, this is it. I think people are starting to take note, but we've got to be careful that they're not just taking note of the sort of pop creatures, the tigers and the sort of, there's a lot of creatures on the planet, and a lot of creatures are important, and a lot of creatures are fascinating. So it needs to be across the board, and you guys bringing that to people's attention is brilliant.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you very much. And I really do hope that we do talk in 3 years, 5 years time, and we'll see a real noticeable impact, because as I say, the conservation measures do work, and particularly in freshwater, if the right environment if the fish are given the right environment, they can bounce back. It's been shown to happen in the ocean, and yeah, well, it can definitely happen. So yeah, fingers crossed. Let's make it happen.
Excellent. Right. Thanks for your time, Michael. And who knows, we may speak in the not too distant about a report that talks about the reduction in endangered fish.
Yeah, let's hope so. Alan, thanks very much for having us on. Really enjoyed that.
No problem. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Cheers, you too. Bye.
Bye.